Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the conference on Montreal. We appreciate you joining us after that short break, and indeed it was a short break, so we appreciate your diligence. This afternoon we're going to take a few minutes to talk about global events. We believe that most leaders of companies, as well as leaders, have to do so with a spreadsheet in one hand and the newspaper in the other. We're all aware of the global events that have affected us yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And we want to set the stage this afternoon to have that discussion. Certainly we have a distinguished panel in presence and virtually, which I will introduce in a moment, but we want to use this to set the stage for a lively discussion this afternoon. First, I want to take just a few moments, if I may, in my role as responsible for global intelligence for Crisis 24 and GardaWorld, which is our parent company, to give as we would say in the military, a big hand over the map, kind of a quick view of the world, current events, to set the stage for very insightful discussions. None of these factors have more importance than others, depends on your business and where you are in the world. But starting in Europe, certainly Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine is paramount in people's minds. Again, certainly 6 months ago, no one have conceived of the concept that Finland, who has stood steadfast against the Soviet Union for decades, and Sweden would decide to join NATO rather vociferously. We look at the effect on global supply chain and food security into the Black Sea, beginning to see some of the ports opening up on the periphery. But what will be the decisions in the short term and the midterm on the allowing of maritime shipping to resume in the Black Sea? Certainly impactful. Across Europe, with elections and nationalistic governments, we're seeing the protest from cost of living and inflation, and that impact on both population and governance. We shift down to the Middle East. Again, not too far in the past, the idea of a defense pact between the Arab nations and Israel would have been inconceivable. The demarches that have been made, I think, bode well for the region, midterm and long term. And certainly the business opportunity and initiatives that will bring about are important as well. Shifting to sub-Saharan Africa, again, you see the impacts of the lingering and strong impacts of the pandemic on populations who could not work remotely, who were very bound by the physical world, and you're seeing the impact of food security in those regions as well. As a plus, and I do want to hasten to add that when you look at the malaria vaccines that are being rolled out by World Health Organization and other initiatives, it does bode well for populations that in many ways have been very much underserved. Shifting to Latin America, we see a lot of recent elections. In 4 countries, the presidential elections have been decided by less than 20% of the vote by the population. That's endemic of the dissatisfaction with the existing governments that are governing there, as well as, again, a region of the world that was very severely impacted by COVID and communities that were very dependent on physical labor and the physical processes that surround them. In addition to these changes of government, whereas traditionally there's a honeymoon period where the governments have an opportunity to align themselves and address the priorities of their population, we're not seeing the patience of the population. So we think that is going to continue to exacerbate the challenges of some of these countries that are trying to be governed by new administrations. Brings up the issue of nationalism and nationalization of resources. That could be a factor as well in Latin America. Turning to Asia, as we look at the zero tolerance policy in China for COVID, certainly we anticipate that will continue until the end of the calendar year, at the very least through the November Communist Party Congress that is in November. So we think that'll bring about unanticipated business disruptions, as well as travel restrictions and travel changes at a moment's notice. Final point I would make, and it certainly is a tragedy with the assassination of former Prime Minister Abe, but we don't see that as having profound geopolitical impacts as far as the Japanese governments or their involvement in the world's economy. Certainly under the Abe governments, there was already a move for the Japanese to become a more member of the international community in regards to defense and other geopolitical events. So we see that as continuing on course. Again, that's kind of a tour of the world in 5 minutes, and I want to use that as an opportunity to set the stage for the discussion among this distinguished panel. And if I may take a moment to introduce them. Okay, immediately to my left, Karl Tabbakh, the managing partner of the Québec region for McCarthy. Thank you, sir. Penny Wise, CEO, 3M Canada. Perrin Beatty, president and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. And virtually, Kevin Scott, who's the Chief Refining and Supply Officer for Irving Oil. So as advertised, certainly you have a group that's well-versed in dealing with the international economies and global circumstances. So we'll kind of start off the discussion, if I may, with Kevin, our virtual participant. And again, kind of setting the stage where we started the conversation, what have you seen has been the challenges and the impact of the Ukraine for your industry and the broader sectors that you're involved in?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And thanks everyone for the opportunity to be part of the discussion today. All the sponsors and organizers bring this together for these important discussions. Over the last 2 years, we've really seen the extremes of energy demand from the industry-wide impacts, first of COVID, and then now to the market volatility that we see with the invasion of Ukraine. Now, throughout these times, our company has had to respond to both low demand and then high demand and high prices. And, first and foremost, it's been our employees' commitment to keeping themselves safe and keeping our customers safe that has been just exceptional through this time period. I would say the learning for us, like many companies, is really about being resilient in many areas, things like supply chain planning and developing new products. And really this kind of shifting global landscape, I think, has accelerated our ability to learn and adapt to changing circumstances. Some of these lessons are now guiding our responsiveness and increased speed of responsiveness to energy transition, which we've been embracing through kind of everyday actions in our planning and setting some meaningful targets, which I'll come to in a few minutes. There's really three kind of interesting examples from COVID that you might not think about from an energy company that kind of exemplify some of those things. First, there was a nationwide need for hand sanitizer back in the early days of the COVID situation. And under some pretty tight timelines, we developed a new product that was best in class and certified by Canada and the US at our facility here in St. John, New Brunswick. And we shipped out our first batches of that directly to the front line. So some 3,500 liters of hand sanitizer right to hospitals and clinics. Professional drivers, if people remember at the start of the pandemic, were critical in terms of delivering goods that we all needed. But they were having a hard time getting services, food, and the like. And we served close to 50,000 free breakfasts across our system to our professional drivers to keep them fed and on the road, getting all of us the goods that we needed. And then similarly, out in our restaurants, big stops, we didn't have online ordering, and we put online ordering in place in a matter of weeks. And so really resilient work by our IT team and our sales team that did that. And a shout out to IT teams across all of our companies that had to get us all working from home and remotely so efficiently. All of that, I would say, as I mentioned, it's really about learning and adapting and increasing the pace of being able to adapt to changes. And so energy, as we all know, is a critical infrastructure. It's critical to all of our functioning economies. And we've seen that very much in the last 6 months here. with interruptions and supply chains having to be reworked. And we feel that, the lessons from all of that is really helping us accelerate here from an energy transition perspective. So we're building credible plans. Planning is key these days, and thinking about all the things that you need to do and all the critical elements of making that successful. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you very much. And you speak of planning. Maybe it's a good transition for Karl as far as the advice you're seeing with your client base.
Sure. Well, thanks, Mike. Et d'abord, merci beaucoup. Ça me fait grand plaisir d'être ici. Merci à la conférence de Montréal, à tous les commanditaires. It feels really good to have people coming from all around the world, all around the country to our beautiful city for this conference. So congratulations to the organizers. It's a great pleasure to be here. In terms of impact, two comments maybe. There's the impact on our business of Ukraine. It was mainly regulatory. We realized that because of the sanctions and the regulatory regime, we had to comply with it. Even though we don't have business in Russia and we don't have business in Ukraine, we realized that we had a lot of clients that were impacted by that, and that we had to make sure that our business was ready to face that. But more importantly, really is the business of our clients and how we advise clients. One of the things that you were mentioning is where planning, right? And today we're seeing more and more that geopolitics is really high up on the radar of CEOs. If it is becoming a very, very critical KPI. You said that we do business plans with an Excel spreadsheet in one hand and the newspaper in another hand. I think it's even beyond that. Businesses need to be very strategic about understanding geopolitics, not only from a risk assessment perspective, but also from an opportunity perspective. Because obviously, whenever there's disruption, there's the risk that's associated with it, but there are the opportunities, and we're seeing more and more, that risk management. It used to be a PR job. You'd give your PR team, you say, handle geopolitics, whatever happens, you'll come up with a press release. I'll be able to say that, and things are going to be everyone's going to be happy. It doesn't work that way anymore. The level of scrutiny that the businesses are under are simply unimaginable if you don't plan for them. And therefore now geopolitics must rest with the board, with the CEO. We're seeing chief geopolitics officers positions now being created in some organizations. And this is clearly now a trend. Obviously, there's, I think we were talking about that before, there's the known unknowns and the unknowns, and I need to remember who made that famous, but I think it was a U.S. president or U.S.
Defense Secretary.
The Defense Secretary who got them confused. But it was very difficult for any organization to plan for the pandemic, for instance, right? We did not have contingency plans of everyone working from home and nobody showing up and lockdowns and everything. But but there are some geopolitical events that we can foresee if we put the time to think things through, to read things through, to understand where the dynamics, where the tectonic plates are moving, and how do we react to that? And we put now our annual budgets, our business plans, our strategic plan to a stress test. We don't put it to the stress test of what would happen if we have to shut down everything and nobody wants to buy our services, but we put it to a stress test of deeper protectionism from our south of the border neighbors, for instance, right? And we think about that and what the impact of that. And I think we're seeing that more and more with businesses.
Yeah, good point, Karl. And speaking of resilience, certainly Penny has lived through all permutations of that, if she'd like to speak to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Kevin, you started talking about resiliency. So first of all, thank you for the invitation today. I'm really delighted to be here and be with such a great group and some really interesting discussion. But as we think about resiliency, I think as Canadians, we should all take a moment and pat ourselves on the back for how resilient we have been over the last 2 years. And you think about, with all the uncertainty and all the unknowns, how we have all responded, whether it's through business, whether it's through our communities, whether it's through other organizations to help each other, to lift each other up, to make sure that we were going to get through the pandemic successfully. And I always talk about the inventiveness that happened during the pandemic. Kevin, you talked about switching over and making hand sanitizer in a matter of days. You talked about delivering food, curbside pickup, hybrid meetings, kind of all sorts of things that we had thought would take 5-10 years for us to roll out. We did in a really short period of time. But for us, from a 3M Canada perspective, the most important or biggest example of resiliency is the shortage of personal protective equipment that happened in Canada at the outset of the pandemic, and that in Canada, no one was manufacturing N95 respirators. All of the respirators were coming in from outside of Canada. And internally at 3M, I worked with our global team, I worked with our domestic team, I worked with the federal government, the Ontario government, and together as a team, we were able in 7 months, which I think is a record in our own and in the to put together and expand one of our manufacturing facilities in Brockville, Ontario, so that we could produce N95 respirators to support the healthcare and frontline workers here in Canada. And the incredible pride that our team takes in what we were able to accomplish in that short amount of time really speaks to the resiliency. But what it also kind of, when we think about impacts, it made me really think about, what is Canada's industrial strategy? What are the things that we need to have in Canada that we need to make domestically so that we are ready for future events? The reality is in Canada, we can manufacture anything that we want. It's just, what are Canadians willing to pay for it? And Canadians expect choice. So it really is an opportunity for us to consider, what does an industrial strategy look like for this country moving forward? And how do we balance that with our status as such a strong trading nation? Canada has more trade agreements with other countries than any other country in the world. So moving forward, as we think about the age of uncertainty, as we think about supply chain resiliency, as we think about supply chain uncertainty, this idea of what do we need to do here at home, what are those most important sectors that we need to participate in, that becomes an incredibly critical part of thinking for the future and what those impact, or how we take that impact, how we learn from it, and how we move forward.
That's excellent point, Penny. I think that leads into a comment Perrin made earlier about kind of the strategic objective that Canada wants to take and what that looks like.
Well, I think just building on what Penny was saying, I think what is important for us is to have a plan, for us to know what it is we're trying to achieve. If we look at COVID, for example, as we move out of COVID, one of the things that we should be doing is what the military does after an operation. They do a postmortem. And the goal shouldn't be to try to assign blame. As Penny was mentioning, we were all building the aircraft as we were flying in it. None of us had experienced anything like this before. But the question is, what are the lessons that we've learned? I don't think, if you look back at SARS, that we actually learned the lessons of SARS and that we were properly prepared. There are two mistakes that we could make here coming out of COVID. The first is to say, boy, we dodged that bullet, and to roll over and go back to sleep. The second is to prepare for COVID. What we should be doing is asking ourselves, what has this taught us, and what have the events of the last couple of years taught us about the nature of crisis in the world? The one thing that we do know is there will be more crises. By nature, they're not predictable, other than the fact that there will be. It could be a climate crisis. It could be terrorism. It could be another invasion similar to what was done by Russia into Ukraine. It could be a pandemic that will make us feel wistful about COVID. The question is, how prepared are we for these various circumstances? And there are a number of threads that we can draw out of our experience, whether it's out of 9/11 or out of COVID or out of other crises that we've had to deal with, that will help us to develop, first of all, the capacity to be resilient and to respond effectively and to not have to shut everything down. But the other is to look at, how is the world changing and how should we change with it? Penny was talking about the fact that a great challenge for us was to have personal protection equipment early in the pandemic. Again, one of the things the military does is that when I was defense minister, we focused on the defense industrial base. You ask yourself, what is it that Canada, or in partnership with the United States, what is it that we have to have the capacity to be able to produce here in order to supply ourselves in a crisis? We need to do that for other pandemics or for other types of crises, and ask ourselves how we build the strength and resiliency. It would be a mistake to say we simply onshore everything. That makes no sense at all. Our goal has to be security of supply. How do we ensure that we have what we need to have at the time that it becomes necessary? So that could involve diversifying our supply base to more than one supplier. It could involve stockpiling, and it could involve onshoring and bringing business to Canada as well. But we need a plan. We need to do it in a period of calm, and it needs to be something that is adaptable to different types of emergencies.
Yeah, point well made. And to that point on planning, I'll speak from our company's experience a few years ago to do a tabletop exercise on pandemic planning. Got very few recipients. It just wasn't either the topic or just the idea of tabletop and contingency planning just wasn't in the conversations with our clients. That has changed, as Karl alluded to it, as well as the rest of the panel, that companies are starting to look at what they should plan for and prepare for. It bodes both for resilience as well as just, and I would say as an intelligence professional that good awareness, good planning of geopolitical situations let companies and organizations act more boldly. You have a higher level of confidence, or you feel the list of unknowns have been reduced to a degree that you can make some strategic business decisions. So it all bodes well, I believe, from the business planning base. It's just how it's applied, and certainly our eyes have been opened by the process. Kevin, back to you. When we look ahead, both for Irving Oil and challenges in the next decade, what do you see as this kind of having reshaped your point of view?
Well, as I mentioned before, I think the current situation has really upped our game from a planning and resiliency perspective, as we've all talked about. And for us, this is going to be a continuation of a path we've been on for close to 100 years as a company. Really, our goal to position Irving Oil for long-term resilience and growth through the energy transition, providing the products safely that our customers and our communities want. We have established a challenging but credible company-wide emissions goal, so to reduce our Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 30% by 2030, so 30% by 2030. And we've further committed our support and leadership to the long-term journey to net zero emissions by 2050. And these goals, we believe, are aligned with the countries where we operate in Canada, in the US, and in Ireland. All of that's going to be managed and successful with the people that we have working with us, our employees, our customers, and all the communities where we work. And all of that clear goal and clear path with people comes with setting some people goals too. So having a great environment where diversity and inclusion thrives, where we've got gender parity in our corporate areas, raising our number of female leaders by close to 40% by 2030, and focusing on an environment where people feel like they are part of that success story. Some of the opportunities really come from creating brand new partnerships with local suppliers, with new folks that we have maybe worked with before, whether that's universities or different suppliers. And I'll give you a few examples. Over in Ireland, in the last year, we started processing used cooking oil and turning it into renewable diesel that helps us meet our obligations in Ireland and provides the product that customers are looking for from us. All of that had to be created from a brand new supply chain. So finding those supplies, trucking them, processing them through the refinery, and then finally getting them out to customers for the products they wanted. We're making conversions in our refineries. We just did a large job in our St. John refinery where we converted an old steam-powered driver to an electric motor, which is highly efficient. again, helps us meet those CO2 emissions goals that I stated before. And then again, back in Ireland, we're working with universities and other companies to pilot carbon capture from stacks in our refinery. So one of the few and first projects of its kind in the world to actually capture the CO2 out of emissions and then work with others to figure out how we're going to sequester those. And so, our experience in this industry and then our ability and willingness to innovate and to work with others right across different sectors, we believe is going to help us capture the opportunity that's here with energy transition. And so we're excited about, building the relationships. We're excited about serving our customers with new products they want. And, we're already thinking about the products of the future, things like green hydrogen. And how do you start to build the supply chain that will be required for that, from production to transportation and then to the end consumer. So a lot of exciting things underway. And we're looking forward to progressing all of those.
Thank you. Very good comments. I want to pick up on something you said regarding the diversity, and certainly Penny and I were speaking earlier about that. I'd like to speak to certainly the champion of that, and how you've seen that change over the recent years.
So, Kevin, thank you for kind of starting the spark of that. As we're thinking about the future, as we think about the economy of Canada and we think about our economic growth for the future, I think we really have to think about our workforce, and that making sure our workforce in Canada, whether it's me at 3M or all of us as business leaders, making sure our workforces reflect the diversity of Canada. When you think about the pandemic, a greater number of women chose to leave the workforce during the pandemic in order to stay home, to make sure children went to school, to look after elders, just to keep households going. And many of those women have not returned to work. And in some ways, the movement of women into senior roles is even more challenging because some of those middle managers and those mid-level female employees are no longer in the workforce. So how do we encourage them to come back to the workforce? What is it that we need to provide? The working your way, the flexibility, the hybrid models, I think these are all an important component of that and able to help us drive forward on that. But not only that, we need to also support our small businesses. Small businesses were decimated during the pandemic, and making sure that we have the resources in place to support those small businesses, many of which were owned by women and entrepreneurs. I also, from working for a science company, have a significant interest, plea, comment to make around STEM equity. We do a survey annually in Canada where we ask Canadians what do they think about science. We call it the State of Science Index. And 70% of Canadians believe that people in underrepresented groups do not get the same access to STEM education and STEM jobs in this country. So what is it that we need to do as a business community to make sure that those STEM equity opportunities are in place? And that having STEM and that knowledge base for the future is what is going to help move our economy forward. We need to reskill and put people into roles where there are high growth economic opportunities, high growth sectors for the good of our future. And then also, of course, skilled trades. That is the other place where there is a shortage of workers. I think I heard there's 100,000 open skilled trades right now. So it's an opportunity for us to, again, point people in different directions, new directions, to really reskill and have an organization, have a country that's ready. Our economic recovery really depends on us having people in the right jobs, in the right places in order to propel us forward. And that is definitely an impact that we need to focus on for the future and making sure we bring that forward.
Good point. And I'd like to continue that conversation kind of from a business point of view, and if you would, Karl.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I totally agree with everything that Penny's saying on diversity and on having a workforce that's reflective of our society. But when just your question on what do you anticipate is where things are going. Part of that, I think as business leader, you need to be able to look at what is the status of the different elements of crisis and understand which ones are circumstantial and which ones have deeper roots, right? And to take some examples right now, price of commodities or even price of entrance generally, right? That could resolve itself. Like things could go back to normal. Labor shortage is probably a deeper problem. There's circumstantial, but there's also a very fundamental demographic problem with labor shortage, particularly in societies like Canada, where the pyramid doesn't really look like a pyramid anymore. It looks more like an inverted pyramid. And therefore, when you look at that, you need to have a plan. You need to have a plan because not only this is going to impact the ability to have people work in your business, but it's going to impact the ability to move the needle on diversity. And because frankly, if unemployment rate is at 2% and you can't get anyone to apply for the job, it's going to be really difficult to move the needle on who you attract. So, but that requires planning that goes beyond your business. That requires planning that requires a dialogue with the government on this. And when we talk about dialogue with government, I'm talking about immigration, which is something that the business community has been talking quite a bit about to the various levels of governments. And I believe that this is one area where we need to change the mentality, the way we look at immigration. Being an immigrant myself, I've benefited a lot from being and immigrating to this country and having a lot of the benefits of the country. But I think we're no longer in an era where we are just a welcoming society. We assume that everyone wants to come to Canada. I think we're going to be in a society, in a world where we're going to be in competition with a lot of countries on attracting immigrants. And we're going to have to build a narrative, a business narrative. We're going to have to build a societal narrative, but we're going to first and foremost need a proactive strategy of recruitment. The way that you approach recruitment in your own businesses, we call it, whether we call it war on talent or active recruitment or what have you, that we need to get to that mental shift as well as a country so that we have the depth of talent pool available for our businesses. So that's an example of, this has nothing to do, in my view, with COVID or with COVID is probably a spark that has led to where we are today. But there are some deeper roots today in labor shortage, and if these don't get addressed, we're going to struggle to find a solution to that.
Yeah, excellent point. I think it offers up a segue both from Penny's point on STEM as well as Perrin's earlier point on kind of a strategic objective. From the Chamber of Commerce and just from the community's point of view, how does that really shape what the strategic direction should be for the businesses?
Well, let's start with government itself. We have to have a plan for the country in terms of what we want to achieve. And we have to set our goals much higher than we have. Now, the goal shouldn't be to go back post-COVID to where we were prior to COVID with 2% growth. And every projection indicates that although the economy was starting to come back very strongly this first period, that over the course of the next 30 or 40 years, we'll see very limited growth in Canada and we'll fall back behind other countries. So we need to have a strategy, a national strategy, and Penny was talking about that earlier, that will help us vault into a position of leadership in the world as opposed to having the gap between us and the leaders continuing to grow. Skills is an essential part of that. There's no employer I talk to anywhere in Canada who doesn't cite skills as a major problem. I guess I would even go beyond skills. It's often unskilled labor that you can't get. Talk to people in the hospitality sector about that. So where's the strategy? How are we going to deal with the demographics of an aging society? We were for so long, as Penny points out, for so long, it wasn't discriminating against a minority, we were discriminating against the majority. Yep. And what country, we're a rich country. We're not so rich that we can afford to waste the skills of anybody in this society, let alone 51% of the population or more. Immigration. Karl is absolutely correct. But this is an incredible opportunity for us right now. I believe the great split globally is not between left and right. It's between open and closed societies. As we see societies turning in on themselves, seeing the rest of the world as a threat, Canada still is open to the world. And we have the potential to attract the best and the brightest in the world to come to Canada. But we have to invite them here. And we have to not simply say, well, welcome to Canada, you're on your own, good luck. We have to look at how do we integrate them into our economy and give them the opportunities that every Canadian has. You need a plan. And it needs to start with government, and business has to build on that and integrate into that. Business is more than prepared to do its part. What I learned from the pandemic was, Penny, you remember when the government was terribly worried about PPEs, and they said, are there companies out there willing to retool to make PPEs or to help in other ways? They were flooded by the number of companies that volunteered. And Irving Oil is a case in point. So business is there, it's innovative, it's anxious to play its part, but what we need is a clear template from government about what are we trying to achieve and how do we get there from here, and it needs to be something ambitious.
That's an excellent point. Penny, in your experience, are there examples that draw on that as far as where 3M has tried to open up the opportunities for the community?
So, learning from the pandemic, obviously this crisis, and then just Karl, to your point about the impact for the future. One of the areas that I've been thinking a lot about is the divide between those who have and those who do not have, and that how the pandemic really highlighted, at least in the community where I live in London, Ontario, those in poverty. In London, Ontario, 1 in 4 children lives below the poverty line. And for me, in Canada, that's a really unacceptable and frightening statistic. And that those of us in business, that it's not only our job to help build our businesses, but it's also about making sure that we are serving the communities that we live in and that we work in, and that we are supporting those in need. And so, again, like many of you here, many of the panelists, stepping up and supporting the community, making sure the United Way or our other charities of choice were supported to make sure we could help those in need in the community, very much focused on. The other part was also taking care of internal employees on the mental health side. I think the one thing that has come out of the pandemic that I think in some ways is a silver lining for us to think about for the future is not just physical health, but also thinking about mental health and how do we support the mental health of our employees, of our communities, and those who work with us. And again, at 3M, we did a lot of work to make sure that we were supporting the mental health, checking in, speakers, events. We were a lot of focus on making sure the wellness piece and recognized for that. And I think all of us need to think about what does that extended wellness, extended support of our employees and our communities and that heart, what does that need to look like? I looked at the Edelman Trust Barometer last week that came out for the Canadian stats, and it's very clear that people are looking to business as leadership. People are looking to us as business leaders, all of us, I mean that very generically, to help, to make a difference, to help move us in the right direction. And I think as we move forward, as we think about the plans for the future, as we think about what that big plan needs to be or what we do strategically, we need to think about that and take on that leadership.
Good. Karl, any comments in regards to that?
I mean, I think Penny's really very well articulating the fact that business leaders are becoming more than just business managers, right? So the idea of having to, the company needing to look at the interest of various stakeholders. I think this is also part of the mission of a company, and this is why. Because you're expected as business leader to all of a sudden have an opinion on all sorts of things, you're expected almost to have a political agenda, in addition to your business agenda. And because you have to do that, having a good read on the geopolitical forces and having a good read on what's going on in your own country, but also in the neighboring countries, having a good understanding through specialists or through business associations like the Canadian Chamber or others, being able to understand that landscape is becoming a critical asset, I mean, there isn't a week that goes by that we don't hear that a CEO lost his or her job for something that is, 15 years ago, we would have said it's totally unrelated to the business. Right? Because you look at the stock price is doing pretty well. You look at the profit margins, they're good. Why is that CEO losing his or her job? Well, because of the expectations that today's markets have on businesses. And this is why we're sitting here talking about that. And this is why you guys are advising so many companies on these topics. And it's very, very important. There's one thing I wanted to maybe just mention. When preparing for this, I looked at what are the top geopolitical issues for CEOs, right? And apologies for all my friends in the Big Four, but one of the Big Four had run that survey, and I forgot to note which one that is. But it was very well done survey. In 2019, sort of the top three priorities were the changing role of the U.S. in the world, the post-Brexit EU stability, and the China-US relationships. And so fast forward to today, what are we talking about? We're talking about, the energy crisis and supply of energy. We're talking about COVID, post-COVID, return to work, return to post-COVID growth, the post-COVID agenda, and supply chain disruption. So no one's talking about Brexit anymore. I was talking about the stability of Europe post-Brexit and not that it's gone away, but now there are other things that we have to change. So it's a very fast-moving world, and if you just have PR handling it, you'll never be able to elevate that to the strategic level that is required, and it just goes to show that from 2019 to 2020, we all of our businesses evolved significantly. We all remember March 13, 2020, right? What we were doing, where we were sitting when we sent everyone home and we shut the businesses. But between then and today, there are so many more events that have happened and that are now highlighting the need to be ready and to bring that geopolitical. We use the word geopolitics at the forefront of everything we do.
Yeah, no, good point. And I think we're seeing it more and more in businesses and in every organization about anticipating. I don't want to invoke Wayne Gretzky in the wrong crowd, but the idea of anticipating, skating where the puck is going to be, I think has become even more critical to all leaders as well. So.
Well, social media won't let you forget, right? Like you have to be prepared.
Good point. The speed with which you have to respond, to be prepared to respond.
Guy Lafleur was pretty good at it too.
What's
Guy Lafleur was pretty good at it too.
Absolutely, yes. I knew that was on thin ice. Pardon the pun in that regard. Farron, any thoughts?
There's no doubt that we have to prepare for the things that we know are coming. Climate change is something that's not going to go away. We're going to have to manage that, prepare for it, fight it, mitigate it, and so on. And there are a number of other issues. We mentioned the aging of Canadian society as an example. But by the very nature, you're in crisis management and crisis aversion. By the very nature, crises are not predicted for the most part. And the real question is, how do you respond when a crisis arises? And in any crisis, we all wish that they didn't exist, but in any crisis, there is both a threat and an opportunity there. And just to cite an example about the need for suppleness on the part of societies, you look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the question we should ask ourselves is, what should Canada's role be? Does Canada have a strategy today of any sort? Do we know what it is if Canada has one? Well, let's take a look at it. Where could Canada make a contribution? Security. Russia is a threat to its neighbors. Guess who one of the neighbors is? Guess where Russia is increasing both its commercial and its military resources, but in the Arctic, where it abuts on Canada. We could be doing more there. Business can be part of that, and government as well. And it can also be in partnership with the U.S. to help to rebuild a strategic partnership with the U.S. Energy. Canada has vast supplies of energy and has the potential, but not the capacity to deliver it. It has the potential to help the democracies stop subsidizing countries that invade their neighbors or repress their citizens. But what are we doing to get our product to market? Chancellor Scholz will be here in Canada in a few weeks. I met with him 3 weeks ago, and he said to me, we need Canadian energy. There's a role that we can play. Agriculture and food. We're seeing the price of food go up through the roof. Canada can be a major supplier there. We can be a major supplier for fertilizers. Today, it's Russia and Belarus produce 40% of the potash in the world. Canada's the other key supplier. We could step that up. You look at critical minerals, which are essential for us to make the transition to a green economy, but essential also for security devices. And Canada can play a key role there in conjunction with the United States as well. And we can rebuild potentially a relationship with the United States that's moved from being strategic to being transactional. We can position ourselves as a country again as one that is strategic and helping to solve problems as opposed to just complaining about problems.
Points well made. Looks like we're down to just a few minutes left. I'd like to give each one of our panelists an opportunity for any closing comments. Kevin, we'll start with you if we may.
Sure, and again, thanks for the opportunity. I really like some of the themes that we were just talking about, which were really people-centered, right? It was people-centered around the employees in our companies and looking after them from a mental wellness perspective, from a diversity perspective, so that everyone can be successful. Our communities, dealing with immigration, dealing with food shortage and food security, and then the relationships that we have with others around the world. And so, as we get back out there, rebuilding relationships, all of that comes down to people-centered focus on a number of these issues that we're tackling. It's how we approach things here. One of our taglines, or really values, more than a tagline, a value for us is that people matter. And that's been the heart of our company for the last 100 years. It'll be the heart of our company for the next 100 years. And it will help us tackle these problems if we can just get a little more focused on building and rebuilding some of those relationships that have been strained.
Thank you very much. Penny?
So I wanted to just circle back to where we started, where Kevin started talking about resiliency right off the top. And there are some lessons for resiliency or things that I remind myself about. The first one is not to get bogged down in the day-to-day, that occasionally, Karl was talking about seeing and looking for the future. Got to raise your head and look up and see what's around. And that means getting out and talking to customers because they know the challenges they're facing. How can we help? How can we mitigate? How can we support? And then finally, the people on your teams, they are the experts. They are the ones who know how to get through crisis. They know how to anticipate what's coming. Draw on the expertise that you have inside your organizations to help you get there.
Excellent. Thank you, Penny. Karl?
We're talking about sort of what's coming on the horizon. I just want to leave that with maybe one thought in terms of succeeding in our post-COVID return to work. I just want to pick up on what Kevin said. Being like, it's all about people, but it's also all about people being together. The energy of having your team together, of being back, is not only good for business. It's good for our ecosystem. It's good for our cities. It's good for what makes living in a place so pleasant. And my hope is that we will be back to a mode where people get together more often, where people eat together more often, where people interact together more often. And I think as business leaders, we have a responsibility in that front to be able to attract our people back to the office in what could be a bit of a hybrid or whatever. Flexibility is going to be the new norm. But I sincerely hope we're going to be living in a world where people interact personally as opposed to just through screens.
Virtually, once again. Yeah. Parent?
I want to bring it back to the country again, to Canada. Canadians are the most fortunate people anywhere in the world in terms of our history, our geography, the society that we live in, our resource wealth, and so on. The question is whether or not we're living up to the potential of this country. And I guess what I would argue is that we need to be aspirational, whether it's our businesses or our governments. We need to stop shooting for the bronze. We need to start shooting for the gold. And to fully live up to our potential, we need goals that are aspirational, that challenge and inspire young Canadians. And we need to have the discipline and the strategy to be able to achieve things that don't seem achievable for us to get from here to there. I'd leave it simply with the example that all of us know of President Kennedy making the commitment to put an American on the moon within 10 years. He didn't know that the Americans would be able to do it. The only thing that he knew was that if he didn't make that commitment, they wouldn't be there. We have to set our sights higher as well.
Yeah, well said. Again, everyone, we're at the finish of the session. I want to thank everyone for their participation. Certainly, this has been an excellent panel for their insights and their points of view. So I want to thank everyone for your attendance today, and thank you all.